Hi. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nura Khalees, and ever since I was a little kid, I've been obsessed with the Land of Oz. My first exposure to Oz was, of course, the 1939 film. Now, of course, there are queer readings of the film. I mean, there's a reason queer people are referred to as Friends of Dorothy. But I'm going to talk mostly about the books. L. Frank Baum wrote 14 Oz books. Some of them are better than others. And there's even more queer readings of the books than there are of the movie. Now, I'm not saying that this was intentional by Baum. As far as I know, he never commented on the queer content of his books. Funnily enough, there are 190 uses of the word queer over the course of Baum's 14 Oz books. There's a great exchange in The Road to Oz where Polychrome, the daughter of the rainbow, says, "You have some queer friends, Dorothy." To which Dorothy replied, "The queerness doesn't matter, so long as they're friends." Queer was already starting to be used to mean homosexual, but it was still mostly used to mean strange or odd. So it's not necessarily a reference to homosexuality. Now I'm going to start with a quick summary of the book The Marvelous Land of Oz, which is probably my favorite Oz book and the one with probably the clearest queer subtext. Tip is a boy who was raised as a servant by the wicked sorceress Mombi. One day, when Mombi was away, Tip decided to play a prank on Mombi for when she came back, and he built a wooden man with a pumpkin head that he called Jack Pumpkinhead. It didn't scare Mombi. Mombi just laughed and brought Jack Pumpkinhead to life with the magic powder of life that she had bought on her trip. Then she told Tip she was going to punish him by turning him to a marble statue in the morning, since she could now have Jack Pumpkinhead do the work for her. So during the night, Tip took Jack and the powder of life and ran away. On the road, Tip met General Ginger on her way to meet up with her all-female army to take over the Emerald City and overthrow the Scarecrow, who was king of Oz at this point. She took Tip with her and found her army, and they took over the Emerald City. Tip, Scarecrow, and Jack escaped the Emerald City to escape Ginger, who had now declared herself queen. Tip had several adventures, trying to reinstate the Scarecrow as king. Eventually, they found Glinda, the Good Witch of the South, and asked her to help restore the Scarecrow to the throne. Glinda said that neither Ginger nor the Scarecrow had a right to the throne. The wizard had stolen the throne from King Pastoria. Pastoria was long dead at this point, so the crown belonged to his daughter, Ozma, who had disappeared as a baby after Pastoria had been overthrown. Glinda discovered that the wizard had visited Mombi around the time that Ozma had disappeared. They found Mombi and eventually got her to admit that the wizard had given her Ozma, and she magically turned Ozma into a boy, Tip. Tip was reluctant to turn back into a girl, but fairly quickly agreed to become Princess Ozma and rule the Land of Oz. It's very easy to read Ozma as a trans allegory. She grew up as a boy, but then became a girl. It should be noted that none of her friends ever misgendered her or dead-named her after she became Ozma. There's also the fact that she was hesitant to become Ozma, which some trans people will find familiar, particularly ones that came out when they were older, like myself. She even tries to bargain by saying, "I might try it for a while, just to see how it seems, you know. But if I don't like being a girl, you must promise to change me into a boy again. She does, in fact, never want to be changed back into a boy. Is it a one-to-one parallel? No. Ozma was born a girl and identifies as a girl. But she was raised thinking she was a boy, and that's close enough for me. Besides, isn't it the perfect fantasy as a trans person to discover that you really are the opposite gender and can be magically turned to that gender? Also, the narrative of running away from a non-accepting parental figure and finding a found family is very familiar to trans youth. Not myself personally, since I didn't come out till I was older, and my family was fortunately very accepting. Though being trans isn't the only way Ozma is queer. Many people read into her relationship as Dorothy as being more than just a friendship. At the moment Dorothy meets Ozma in the book Ozma of Oz, this scene happens. "Oh, thank you very much," cried Dorothy, who, as soon as she heard the sweet voice of the girlish ruler of Oz, knew that she would soon learn to love her dearly. In The Road to Oz, when Dorothy sees Ozma after returning to Oz, this happens. Dorothy threw her arms around her little friend and hugged and kissed her rapturously. That sure does sound like a romantic kiss to me. And when you look at the illustrations from the book by John R. Neal, it looks romantic too. There is also this description in The Lost Princess of Oz. Dorothy was a little Kansas girl who had come to the land of Oz to live and had been given a delightful suite of rooms in Ozma's royal palace, just because Ozma loved Dorothy and wanted her to live as near to her as possible, so the two girls might be much together. Later in the next paragraph it says, Dorothy was the dearest friend of their gracious ruler, and only she, at any hour, dared to seek Ozma in her royal apartments. Looking at this stuff about Dorothy and Ozma's relationship from a modern context definitely gives off a queer vibe, but it might not have at the time that it was written. As my friend Jim McQuarrie said when I brought this up on Facebook, people used to be more physically expressive and open about their emotions. For the past 80 years or so, American culture in particular has indoctrinated itself with ever narrower rules about gender traits, and most especially about outward displays of affection. We live in a time when the only acceptable public affection, especially between members of the same sex, is sexual. All other forms of affection are assumed to be sexual because that's the only type that's tolerated. Siblings can't touch. Nobody can kiss anyone without it being assumed to be sexual. It's sad, really. Ozma and Dorothy could be queer, or they could be expressing normal emotion in a way that's quite common and accepted in their time. Or it could be both. But the way things are is not the way they have always been, will always be, or even ought to be. I especially like the part where he said that they could be queer or they could be expressing emotion normal for their time, or that it could have been both. Because to me, that means that it's open to interpretation. And that really is the point I'm trying to make. A lot of queer people, including myself, see themselves and their experiences in the Oz books. I personally saw myself in Ozma's story, even if it took me 35 years after reading the books to realize that. There's a huge theme of found family in the books. Whether it's Dorothy being raised by her aunt and uncle after her parents died, or finding the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodsman, and the Cowardly Lion when she is stranded in Oz. Ozma also has a found family in Jack Pumpkinhead, the Sawhorse, the Wogglebug, the Gump, and eventually Dorothy. There's also the interesting bit that Dorothy escapes the gray Kansas plains to the colorful Oz. But she always returns to Kansas until the sixth book, The Emerald City of Oz. In that book, Uncle Henry and Aunt Em are about to lose their farm. So Dorothy contacts Ozma and asks if she and her aunt and uncle can move to Oz. Ozma tells her that it's about time she asked, and she agreed. Dorothy originally figures she and her aunt and uncle would live in a farm somewhere in Oz, but Ozma says, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Nope, my girlfriend and her guardians are going to live in my palace with me, and I'm going to make you a full-time princess." When Aunt Em and Uncle Henry were transported to Oz and met Ozma, it took them a little bit of time to get used to the fact that Dorothy's stories of Oz were real, and they now lived in a fairyland. But eventually they got used to the idea. That sounds a lot like coming out as LGBTQ to me. Some of the queer readings of Oz stories have found their ways into actual adaptations. In the short-lived TV series Emerald City, Ozma was more explicitly trans. On the long-running show Once Upon a Time, Dorothy, as an adult, entered into a relationship with Ruby, the adult Red Riding Hood. Ruby even awoke Dorothy from a sleeping curse with true love's kiss. In conclusion, I think it's important to let queer people see themselves in stories like the Oz books. There isn't a lot of queer representation in media. There is more now than there was before, but it's still nothing compared to the amount of straight or cis representation in media. If a trans person sees themselves in Ozma, don't say, well, Ozma wasn't actually trans because she was born a girl and identifies as a girl. If lesbians see themselves in the relationship of Ozma and Dorothy, don't say, they can't be lesbians because they're little girls. Because Dorothy and Ozma are probably around 11 to 13, respectively. And it's definitely possible for people that age to experience same-sex attraction. You could even argue that they are older than that. Let queer people have characters that they identify with. Thank you, and I hope you liked my video. Please like, share, and subscribe. And if I do eventually put out another video, which I hope to, please watch that as well. Thank you.